In 1985, a Wisconsin man named Steven Avery was convicted of a brutal rape and attempted murder. He was 23 years old. He was sentenced to 32 years in prison. For the next 18 years, he said he was innocent. He filed appeals. He maintained his account. Nobody in Manitowoc County believed him. In 2003, DNA technology that did not exist in 1985 identified the actual perpetrator. His name was Gregory Allen, a man who had been a suspect at the time of the original crime, whose name had come up in the investigation, and who investigators had set aside in favor of Steven Avery. Steven Avery walked out of prison on September 11, 2003. He had been inside since he was 23. He was 41. He filed a $36 million civil lawsuit against Manitowoc County, its former sheriff, and its former district attorney for what had been done to him. 18 months later, while that lawsuit was still in progress, a young photographer named Teresa Halbach disappeared after visiting the Avery family's salvage yard. Her remains were found on the property. Her vehicle was found on the property. Steven Avery's blood was found in her vehicle. He was arrested. He was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In 2015, a Netflix documentary called Making a Murderer told both stories, the wrongful conviction and the murder trial, to a global audience of tens of millions of people. The world has not been able to stop asking what happened ever since. This is the story of Steven Avery, Teresa Halbach, and the case that made a generation question everything they thought they knew about justice. On July 29, 1985, a woman named Penny Bernstein was attacked and sexually assaulted while jogging on a beach on the shores of Lake Michigan in Manitowoc County. She survived. She described her attacker in detail to police. Steven Avery was known to local law enforcement. He had a prior criminal record, a burglary conviction, and a deeply troubling incident in which he had poured gasoline on a cat and thrown it into a fire. He was not a man with a clean background, and Manitowoc County investigators focused on him quickly. Penny Bernstein identified Steven Avery in a photo lineup. She was certain of her identification. She testified to it at trial. The jury believed her. What investigators either did not know or did not pursue at the time was that another man, a convicted sex offender named Gregory Allen, had been identified by a separate law enforcement agency as a suspect in beach assaults in the area. A sheriff's department investigator later testified that he had information about Allen and had conveyed it to the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office during the Avery investigation. That information was not pursued. Steven Avery was convicted and sentenced to 32 years. He would spend 18 of them in Waupun Correctional Institution, maintaining consistently that he had not committed the crime. In 2003, the Wisconsin Innocence Project secured DNA testing on evidence from the original case. The results matched Gregory Allen, who was already in prison for another sexual assault. Penny Bernstein, upon learning of Allen's identification, immediately understood what had happened. She had made a sincere and certain identification of the wrong man. "I don't know if I can ever forgive myself," she said publicly. Steven Avery's conviction was vacated. He came home. After his release, Steven Avery gave interviews. He appeared on television. He was not quiet about what had been done to him. He retained attorneys and filed a civil lawsuit seeking $36 million in damages from Manitowoc County, former Sheriff Thomas Kokorek, and former District Attorney Dennis Fogel. The lawsuit alleged that county officials had known, or should have known, that Gregory Allen was a viable suspect in the 1985 beach attack and had either failed to pursue that information or actively suppressed it in their pursuit of Avery. The suit had legal exposure that made Manitowoc County officials deeply uncomfortable. Depositions had begun. Key figures were being questioned under oath. The financial liability was serious and the reputational damage was already enormous. It was in this context, with depositions ongoing and the lawsuit moving toward resolution, that Teresa Halbach disappeared. The timing has been at the center of the debate about this case ever since. Teresa Ann Halbach was born on December 22, 1980. She was 25 years old in the autumn of 2005. She had recently graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay with a degree in photography and was working as a freelance photographer, taking assignments for Auto Trader magazine, photographing vehicles that private sellers listed for sale. She was known to those who loved her as warm, adventurous, and passionate about her work. Her family described a young woman who was building a life, who was good at what she did, and who was deeply connected to the people around her. On October 31, 2005, Halloween, Teresa had a day of Auto Trader appointment scheduled. Her last confirmed appointment was at the Avery property, Avery's Auto Salvage, a 40-acre salvage yard in rural Manitowoc County where the extended Avery family lived and worked. She was there to photograph a minivan that Steven Avery's sister was selling. She was last seen at the property at approximately 2:30 p.m. She did not return home that evening. Her family reported her missing. The investigation that followed would engulf the Avery salvage yard and reignite every question the county of Manitowoc had hoped Steven Avery's lawsuit would eventually let them put behind them. When investigators began searching the Avery property, they faced an immediate structural problem. Manitowoc County was supposed to recuse itself from the investigation because of the pending civil lawsuit, a lawsuit in which county officials were named defendants. The Calumet County Sheriff's Department was brought in to lead the investigation. But Manitowoc County personnel participated anyway. They provided resources, personnel, and access. Manitowoc County deputies were present during searches of the property. And several of the most important discoveries in the case were made by Manitowoc County personnel who, defense attorneys argued, had an enormous financial and institutional incentive to ensure that Steven Avery was charged with something that would destroy his civil lawsuit. What investigators found on the Avery property? Teresa Halbach's Toyota RAV4, partially concealed with branches and boards in a far corner of the salvage yard. Investigators said it appeared to have been hidden. Human bone fragments in a fire pit near Steven Avery's trailer, later identified through DNA as consistent with Teresa Halbach. A bullet fragment in Avery's garage with Teresa Halbach's DNA on it. Teresa Halbach's camera, phone, and personal digital assistant in a burn barrel near Avery's trailer. And in Avery's bedroom, on the sixth search of the room, a key to Teresa Halbach's RAV4, found by a Manitowoc County deputy, one of the individuals named in Avery's civil lawsuit. Then there was the blood. Investigators found what appeared to be Steven Avery's blood inside Teresa Halbach's RAV4, on the door, near the ignition. This would become the most contested piece of evidence in the entire case. Defense attorneys pointed to something unusual. In the Manitowoc County Clerk's office, stored with materials from Avery's 1985 rape case, was a vial of blood that had been drawn from Steven Avery for that original investigation. That vial had a small hole in the rubber stopper, a hole, the defense argued, consistent with a needle having been used to extract blood from it. They hired an expert who found EDTA, a preservative used in blood storage vials, in the blood samples from the RAV4, suggesting the blood had come from a vial rather than from a living body at the scene of a crime. The prosecution dismissed the defense's frame-up theory as a fantasy. They said the EDTA evidence was inconclusive. They said Avery's guilt was overwhelming. Avery maintained from the moment of his arrest that he was being framed. He said he was being targeted because of the lawsuit. He said the county that had destroyed 18 years of his life was doing it again. Brendan Dassey was Steven Avery's nephew. He was 16 years old in early 2006, with an IQ assessed at around 70 and the social vulnerability that can accompany such a profile. He was, by every measure, a teenager who was easily led, who had difficulty resisting authority, who wanted to please the adults around him, who would say what he understood was expected of him. Investigators questioned Brendan Dassey multiple times. On March 1, 2006, in a session that lasted several hours, without his parents or an attorney present, Brendan Dassey told investigators a story that would become the most damning evidence in the case against both himself and his uncle. He said he and Avery had raped Teresa Halbach in Avery's trailer. He said Avery had shot her in the garage. He said they had burned her body in the fire pit. The confession was graphic and detailed. It was also internally inconsistent. Details changed between tellings. Physical evidence did not match key claims. Investigators searched the garage after Dassey's confession and found no blood, despite his statement that Halbach had been shot there. A bullet fragment was found later in what critics described as suspicious circumstances. Making a Murderer focused heavily on the interrogation footage. The recordings showed investigators feeding information to Brendan Dassey, suggesting answers, encouraging him toward specifics he had not volunteered. Legal scholars who reviewed the footage described it as one of the most textbook examples of coercive interrogation in recent American criminal justice history. In August 2016, a federal magistrate judge agreed. She ruled that Dassey's confession had been involuntary and coerced, and overturned his conviction. The state of Wisconsin appealed. In 2017, the full Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the magistrate's ruling, finding the confession had not been constitutionally involuntary. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case in 2018. Brendan Dassey remains in prison. He has no pending appeals. He will be eligible for parole in 2048. He will be 62 years old. Steven Avery's murder trial began in February 2007 in Calumet County, having been moved from Manitowoc due to the obvious conflict. His defense attorneys, Dean Strang and Jerome Buting, built their case around the frame-up theory, arguing that Manitowoc County had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to plant evidence against a man whose lawsuit threatened to expose and bankrupt the institution. "We had a very tough defense in this case," Buting later said, "because nobody wants to try and use as a defense that the police deliberately tried to plant evidence or frame people." The jury convicted Steven Avery of first-degree intentional homicide on March 18, 2007. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For 8 years, the case remained a Wisconsin story, significant locally but largely unknown outside the state. Then, on December 18, 2015, Netflix released Making a Murderer, a 10-episode documentary series by filmmakers Moira Demos and Laura Ricciardi, who had been following the case since 2005. The series presented both of Avery's convictions, the wrongful 1985 rape conviction and the 2007 murder conviction, and raised, in methodical detail, every question that Avery's defense team had raised at trial: the conflict of interest, the key found by the wrong person on the SIX search, the blood vial with the suspicious stopper, Brendan Dass's interrogation. The series became one of the most watched Netflix releases of its era. Legal academics discussed it. Politicians commented on it. Petition drives demanded a new investigation. Strang and Buting became minor celebrities. The question, "Did Steven Avery do it?" became a national dinner table argument for months. The Halbach family, who had asked for privacy throughout, found themselves caught inside a media phenomenon not of their making, their daughter's death the engine of a true crime cultural moment they could not escape. In 2016, Kathleen Zellner announced that she was taking Steven Avery's case. Zellner is one of the most accomplished wrongful conviction attorneys in the United States, a lawyer who has overturned 17 wrongful convictions in her career. She does not take cases she thinks she cannot win. Her decision to represent Avery was itself a signal to those following the case that she believed there was something substantive to pursue. In June 2017, she filed a post-conviction motion running to 1,272 pages, attacking the original conviction from multiple directions: ineffective assistance of counsel, Brady violations, meaning the prosecution had withheld evidence, and a battery of forensic experts who challenged the state's physical evidence. Her theory of the case points to a named alternate suspect, a person who was a key witness against Avery at trial, as the actual killer. Because that person has never been charged, convention prevents naming them in a video like this. But Zellner's motions allege that new witnesses can place this individual in physical contact with Halbach's vehicle on the night of October 31, 2005, specifically, pushing it into the salvage yard in the dark, where it would be found the next morning. She has also focused on the bone fragments. Evidence gathered after the original trial suggested that bone fragments consistent with human remains had been found in multiple locations, including a county-owned gravel pit, not just in Avery's fire pit. She has argued that this is consistent with the remains having been moved to Avery's property after the fact. And she has continued to contest the blood evidence, the key, and the bullet fragment, arguing that each of these was planted by the actual killer or by law enforcement. After years of filings, hearings, and decisions, the most recent chapter of Steven Avery's legal battle has arrived at a stark conclusion, at least at the state level. On January 15, 2025, the Wisconsin Court of Appeals denied Avery's appeal for the third time, rejecting all 3 arguments Zellner had raised, including her Denny motion to present evidence of the alternate suspect. The court called the evidence speculative and said Avery had not met the standard for a new trial. On May 21, 2025, the Wisconsin Supreme Court declined to review the case. Zellner responded the same day on social media. As expected, the Wisconsin Supreme Court has denied review of Steven's petition. She added, "The average time to undo a wrongful conviction in the United States is 15 years. But many cases have spanned decades with dozens of motions being filed before an individual is freed." Her next step, she announced, would be filing a federal habeas corpus petition, taking the case to federal court for the first time. This is not a quick path. Federal habeas proceedings can take years. The standard for relief is high. But it is the remaining path, and Zellner has stated publicly that her team will pursue it. Steven Avery is 62 years old. He has been in prison, across both convictions, for a combined total of nearly 40 years. Whether he murdered Teresa Halbach or was framed for her murder by the institution that had already wrongfully convicted him once is a question the Wisconsin courts have answered and that Kathleen Zellner has vowed to keep asking. Teresa Halbach's family has watched all of this: the documentary, the petitions, the appeals, the global audience treating their daughter's death as a puzzle to be solved, for 20 years. They have asked, repeatedly, for privacy and respect. Teresa Halbach was 25 years old. She was a photographer. She loved her work. She drove to a salvage yard on Halloween afternoon to do a job she had done dozens of times before, and she did not come home. Whatever happened to her on that property in the last hours of October 31, 2005, whether Steven Avery killed her or whether someone else did and either planted the evidence or took advantage of geography, she deserves to be at the center of this story, not at its edges. Her family has said as much, repeatedly, over 2 decades of a case that turned their daughter's death into a cultural phenomenon they never asked for. Steven Avery maintains his innocence. Brendan Dassey maintains his innocence. Kathleen Zellner is preparing a federal petition. The Wisconsin courts have spoken. The federal courts have not yet been asked. Making a murderer made millions of people feel like detectives. It made millions of people distrust institutions they had previously accepted. It changed the true crime genre permanently. It did not answer the question at its center. Nobody, outside of the people who were there on that October afternoon, knows with certainty what happened. The only certainty is that a young woman is dead, that a man who was wrongfully convicted once is in prison again, and that the question of whether those two facts are coincidence or connection is one the American justice system has not yet fully answered. Subscribe to Quick Crime Vault. Every case in this vault deserves to be told completely, especially the ones the world cannot agree on. We'll see you in the next vault.